What if everything you were taught about the early church was only half the story? Not a conspiracy, not a myth, but a documented, archaeological, historically verified half of the story that was quietly left out of the version you learned in school. Here is what we know for certain. After the crucifixion, the Roman Empire began hunting the followers of Jesus. One by one, the apostles were forced to run. And the official story, the one taught in most Western churches and classrooms, says they went to Rome, to Greece, to Turkey. But there is another story, older, preserved in manuscripts that Rome never touched, kept alive in a civilization so ancient it was already thousands of years old when Rome was still a village. That story says some of the apostles ran south. They ran to Africa. And the evidence has been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at early Christian history the same way again. Let me paint you a picture. It is the year 34 AD. Jerusalem is under the boot of the Roman Empire. The man those followers called their teacher has just been executed, and now Rome has its eye on everyone who walked with him. In Europe, Rome kept detailed records. They documented the trials, the martyrdoms, the executions of early Christians. We have those records. We can read them today. Peter in Rome, Paul on the road to Damascus. The Western story of early Christianity is, in many ways, well documented. But then there is a gap, a significant, deliberate, and deeply curious gap. When historians and scholars trace the movements of certain apostles, particularly after 35 AD, the records go quiet. Not because those apostles stopped moving, but because they moved in a direction Rome was not watching as closely. They moved south. And here is the question that should stop you in your tracks. Why do some of the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts, texts predating the major church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, exist not in Rome, not in Constantinople, but in the highlands of Ethiopia and the monasteries of Upper Egypt? Why does the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuously practicing Christian institutions on earth, claim a direct apostolic lineage that bypasses Rome entirely? And why does that church preserve 81 books in its biblical canon, texts that the Roman Church later decided to remove? Think about that number, 81 books. The Bible most Americans read today contains 66. What is in those other 15 books, and why were they preserved in Africa and removed in Europe? Now, some of you may remember the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, the court official, described in the book of Acts, chapter 8, who traveled to Jerusalem, encountered the apostle Philip, and returned to Ethiopia carrying the faith with him. That story is in your Bible right now. You can read it tonight. But here is the thing most people miss. A high-ranking court official from one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world does not travel alone. He traveled with a delegation, with servants, with guards, with a support network. He was not a lone traveler bringing a new idea home. He was part of a network, a living, breathing, ancient African diplomatic and trade network that connected the interior of the continent to the Mediterranean world. And that network is exactly how some of the apostles made their escape. Let me introduce you to a trade route that most Americans have never heard of, but that was, 2,000 years ago, one of the most sophisticated commercial highways on Earth, the Kingdom of Aksum. By the 1st century AD, Aksum, located in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, was not a small tribal settlement. It was a major world power. Its port city of Adulis on the Red Sea was one of the busiest trading hubs in the ancient world, connecting sub-Saharan Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Aksumite merchants traded gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals. Their ships moved freely through waters that Roman naval power could not always monitor. Their overland routes went deep into territories that Rome could barely name, let alone control. Now here is where the history becomes extraordinary. If you were a follower of Jesus in the year 40 AD and you needed to disappear, really disappear, not just leave town, but vanish from the reach of an empire that wanted you dead, where would you go? You would go somewhere Rome could not follow. And Rome, for all its power, had very limited reach into the Ethiopian highlands, into the interior of Upper Egypt, into the Nile Valley south of Aswan. The further south you went, the thinner Roman authority became. The deserts, the mountains, the ancient kingdoms with their own armies and their own trade networks, these formed a natural barrier. Africa was not just a destination, it was a sanctuary. Now, I want you to think about the mechanics of this, because this is where it gets fascinating. The first-century world ran on trade networks the way our world runs on the internet. If you knew the right merchants, the right routes, the right communities along the way, you could move people, move manuscripts, move ideas, without anyone in Rome ever knowing. And the apostles were not naive wanderers. Many of them were educated men. Matthew had been a tax collector. He understood systems, logistics, record-keeping. Others had traveled with Jesus across regions, interacting with Samaritans, Romans, Phoenicians, Ethiopians. They knew how networks worked. And here is something most Western church history completely ignores. There were already Jewish communities throughout North and East Africa in the first century. Established, rooted communities in Alexandria, in Upper Egypt, in Ethiopia itself. The Beta Israel, the ancient Jewish community of Ethiopia, traces its origins back centuries before Christ. These were not foreign lands to the apostles. They had cultural and religious connections to these places through shared scripture, shared lineage, shared trade. So when we ask how the apostles fled to Africa, the answer is not mysterious at all. It is logistical. It is historical. It is the same answer you would give if someone asked how escaped slaves moved through the Underground Railroad in 19th century America, through networks, through communities, through people who already knew where the safe houses were. Now pause here and ask yourself this question, and I genuinely want you to comment below. If Christianity's earliest roots were just as strong in Africa as in Europe, why did no one teach you that in school? Was it ignorance or something else? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. A Roman historian writing in the 3rd century listed Axum as one of the 4 greatest powers on earth, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. 4 great powers. One of them was African. Does that match what you learned in history class? Let me know in the comments. Let us talk about Matthew. In most Western churches, Matthew is remembered as one of the 12 apostles, the author of the first gospel, and a former tax collector from Capernaum. His gospel is studied in seminaries from Texas to Tennessee. His name is on churches across America. But ask most Western Christians where Matthew died, and you will get silence, or a vague answer, or simply, "we don't know." Here's what is interesting. The Ethiopic Orthodox tradition does not say, "we don't know." It says Matthew came to Ethiopia. It says he preached in the region. It says he was martyred there. And the tradition of his burial, while disputed and complex, has been maintained in East African Christian memory for nearly 2,000 years. Now, Western scholarship will rightly point out that historical verification of these claims is difficult. The sources are ancient. They are oral as well as written, and they exist within a tradition that Rome did not control and therefore did not preserve by Roman standards. But here's the critical question for historians. Why do we treat the Roman record as the default truth and the African record as the burden of proof? The Roman Church had every institutional reason to center the apostolic story in Europe. The African churches had no such political incentive. They simply preserved what their ancestors told them. And what they preserved about Matthew is remarkably consistent across centuries of Ethiopian, Coptic, and North African Christian tradition. He came, he taught, he stayed, he died on African soil. Now let us turn to Bartholomew. And this is where the manuscript question becomes explosive. Bartholomew is perhaps the most mysterious of all the 12 apostles. In the Western tradition, his story is fragmented. He is mentioned in the Gospels but given almost no biographical detail. There are traditions placing him in Armenia, in India, in Arabia. But there is a historical hypothesis, and I want to be clear, this is a hypothesis based on manuscript evidence, not settled fact, that Bartholomew may have carried original Aramaic or Hebrew texts into African territory before those texts were subjected to the editorial process that took place in later church councils. Why does this matter? Because the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and the subsequent councils that followed were not just theological debates, they were also decisions about which texts were authoritative and which were not. Documents were reviewed, debated, and in some cases excluded from the emerging canon. The books that were excluded did not disappear in Africa. Ethiopia kept them. The Book of Enoch is the most striking example. This text was quoted in the New Testament, directly in the Book of Jude. It was known and respected by early Christian communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves of Qumran, contained multiple copies of Enoch, confirming it was widely read and regarded as sacred in the first century. But Rome eventually dropped it from the canon. Ethiopia never did. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible still contains the Book of Enoch. It has been there for over 1,500 years, unbroken, unrevised, intact. So here is the historical puzzle I want you to sit with. If the early apostles, people who knew Jesus personally, who sat with him, who heard him teach, if they valued the Book of Enoch enough to carry it with them on a dangerous journey south, and if Ethiopia preserved it while Rome removed it, what does that tell us about which tradition stayed closer to the original source? I am not telling you what to believe. I am asking you to think. Do you think the books removed from the biblical canon were excluded for theological reasons or for political ones? Leave your answer below. History is not just what happened. History is what was written down, and more importantly, what was kept. In the 4th century, something significant shifted in the Christian world. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and suddenly a persecuted minority movement became the official religion of the most powerful empire on earth. This was, in many ways, a moment of triumph for early Christians, but it also began a process that historians have documented extensively, a process of institutional consolidation. And with consolidation came standardization, and with standardization came decisions about what fit the new imperial narrative and what did not. Let me give you one name as a case study: Origen of Alexandria. Origen was one of the most brilliant theological minds of the early Christian era. He lived from approximately 185 to 253 AD. He wrote thousands of works. He was trained in Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a city in North Africa, and he engaged with Scripture at a depth that few have matched before or since. He was also, by the standards of later Roman Church decisions, declared problematic. In 553 AD, the Second Council of Constantinople posthumously condemned certain teachings associated with Origen. Centuries after his death, his legacy was officially complicated by Roman ecclesiastical authority. Now consider what that means in practical terms. Origen was an African scholar, educated in Africa, working in Africa, drawing on the rich intellectual tradition of Alexandria, and yet his influence on Western Christianity was mediated, filtered, and in some cases actively suppressed by an institution centered in Rome. The pattern repeats. Tertullian, born in Carthage in what is today Tunisia. Augustine, born in Numidia in what is today Algeria. Athanasius, born and based in Alexandria, Egypt. Some of the most foundational thinkers in all of Christian history were African. Yet the dominant narrative of Christian history is told as a European story, with Africa as a footnote. Now, I want to be precise here because this matters. I am not suggesting that Rome was running a secret conspiracy to erase Africa. History is rarely that simple. What I am saying is that institutional power shapes historical memory. When Rome became the center of Christian authority, Roman records became the authoritative records. African traditions that existed outside Roman oversight were not systematically preserved in the same way, were not translated into Latin, were not copied in Roman monasteries. They survived anyway, in Ethiopia, in the Coptic monasteries of Egypt, in the ancient manuscript libraries that Western scholars are still, right now in the 21st century, working to fully catalog and understand. Here is the honest historical question. If Rome was truly the origin point of Christianity's authority, why did the Ethiopian Church have manuscripts that Rome did not know existed until modern scholars discovered them? Think about that carefully, and then ask yourself, who benefits from a version of history that places one city at the center of a story that actually began in the Near East and spread in multiple directions simultaneously, including, powerfully, south into Africa? I want your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this was deliberate, or was it simply the natural result of which power structure survived the centuries? There is no wrong answer. Let us have that conversation. Let me offer you a way of thinking about Ethiopia that might change how you see this entire story. In the modern world, we have cloud storage. When you back up your phone or your computer to the cloud, you are doing something that ancient civilizations did not have the technology to do, but understood the need for instinctively. You are creating a copy of what matters, stored somewhere outside your control, somewhere safer, somewhere that will survive even if the original is destroyed. Ethiopia, for 2,000 years and more, functioned as the cloud storage of ancient sacred knowledge. This is not metaphor for the sake of being dramatic. This is a structural description of what actually happened. When the Library of Alexandria burned, and it burned multiple times in multiple incidents over several centuries, knowledge was lost in ways the ancient world never fully recovered from. When Rome consolidated its theological authority and determined which texts were canonical, other texts were effectively removed from circulation in the Western tradition. But Ethiopia was outside the system. Its monasteries, many of them built on high mountain plateaus in locations physically difficult to reach, preserved texts that the rest of the world forgot it had lost. The Garima Gospels, housed in Abba Garima Monastery in northern Ethiopia, are considered by many scholars to be among the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts in the world. Radiocarbon dating suggests they may date to somewhere between the 4th and 7th centuries AD, making them contemporaneous with, or possibly older than many of the manuscripts used to establish the Western canonical tradition. Let that sink in. Some of the oldest Christian manuscripts in existence are sitting in Ethiopian monasteries, not in Rome, not in the Vatican Library, in Africa. Now let us talk about the Ark of the Covenant, because you cannot discuss Ethiopia's role as a sacred archive without addressing it. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest described in the Hebrew Scriptures, the physical object that the Israelites used to house the Ten Commandments, was brought to Ethiopia centuries before the birth of Jesus, carried by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether or not you accept that specific tradition as historical fact, there is something structurally significant about it. Ethiopia's identity as a preserver of sacred objects, sacred texts, and sacred knowledge is not a modern claim. It is not invented for tourism or national pride. It is embedded in that country's identity going back to antiquity. Multiple ancient sources, Greek, Roman, Jewish, and indigenous Ethiopian, describe Ethiopia as a place of unusual historical and spiritual significance. The apostles who fled south were not going somewhere unfamiliar and alien. They were going somewhere that already had a reputation, already had a network, already had the infrastructure to receive, protect, and transmit what they carried with them. Ethiopia was not just a safe house, it was a vault. And historians estimate that only a fraction of the manuscripts housed in Ethiopian monasteries have been fully translated and studied by the international academic community. A fraction. What do you think is still waiting inside those mountain monasteries, untranslated, unstudied, unknown to the Western world? Leave your speculation in the comments. So let us bring this all together. The apostles did not only go north and west, some went south. They used the trade networks of ancient African kingdoms, networks that Rome could not fully control, to carry the earliest form of the faith into territory that would preserve it for centuries. The manuscripts they brought, or that arrived with early African converts inspired by their teachings, survived in Ethiopian monasteries and Egyptian desert communities. They survived the councils, the wars, the fires, the deliberate and accidental losses that reshaped Western Christianity. And today, scholars who are willing to look outside the Roman-centric narrative are beginning to find the evidence that was there all along. This is not about tearing down one tradition to elevate another. It is about completing the picture. It is about recognizing that the story of early Christianity is not a single thread running from Jerusalem to Rome to the West. It is a web, and some of the oldest, strongest threads of that web run south into Africa. You are not just watching history right now. You are part of a generation that has access to more historical information than any generation before you, and the responsibility that comes with that access is to ask better questions. So here is my final question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments right now. Why do you think it took this long for the African chapter of early Christian history to reach mainstream audiences? Was it institutional? Was it cultural? Was it simply that the textbooks were written by people who did not know or did not want to know? Leave your answer below. Share this video with someone who thinks they already know the full story of early Christianity, because there is a very good chance they have only heard half of it. If you want to go deeper, the Ethiopian manuscripts, the Aksumite trade routes, the full story of the Apostle Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, all of it is connected, and all of it is coming in future videos. Subscribe. Stay with us. The history of Africa is the history of the world, and we are just getting started.